Recently, the topic of sin, specifically envy, has popped up onto my social media feed quite a bit more than it does usually. Sin isn't something that most occultists are normally going to investigate too deeply. And so recently, and by recently I mean at the time of recording, yesterday, I went ahead and I proceeded to ask some occult friends of mine what the worst sin was. What I got instead was everyone saying the stock answer of pride, and then proceeding to grossly misunderstand the esoteric implications of what sins are. And this is something I've studied a little bit, so that is what today's video is about. We're going to be talking about the esoteric viewpoint of sin. I am Dave the Amateur Magus. On this channel I talk all about the mechanics behind ceremonial magic, occultism, esotericism, and the mechanics behind everything you can find within a dusty old grimoire. If you enjoy what I do here and you want to support the channel, link in the description of the Patreon where you can get exclusive access to videos early, Patreon exclusive content, and the Occultic Manual series, which is a monthly write-up that I aim at being more instructional than what I have here on the channel, but less unapproachable than some of the old grimoires I like to talk about on the channel. If any of that sounds of interest to you, link in the description, and if you are already supporting me on Patreon, you have my thanks for your continued and ongoing support. On to the video. The 7 deadly sins, as understood by the general populace, goes something to the effect of this. Pride is don't be prideful and arrogant. Sloth is don't be lazy. Envy, don't desire your neighbor's things. Lust is don't be a sexual deviant. Wrath is don't be a violent deviant. Greed is don't love money more than other people and other things, and gluttony is don't overeat, basically. That is like the layman's understanding of the sins. Now, the interesting thing about these is the 7 deadly sins are not actually sins in and of themselves. Lust is a normal, healthy human desire. Everyone is going to want to experience that. Everyone is going to have moments where they're going to want to be wrathful against something that is harmful. If you're in the middle of the woods and an animal is trying to attack you or your family, you're going to exhibit wrathful qualities. But the real reason that the 7 deadly sins are what they are is because they are the seeds of all other sins. For example, if you are a prideful person, you are going to inherently value the opinions and experiences of other people significantly less. This is how pride causes you to do more sins, because if you are the only one that matters, what does it matter that the NPCs around you are suffering? Each of the 7 deadly sins has a planetary correspondence, and this goes back to the time of the Renaissance. The planets go in this order, and this is how we will be discussing them for the rest of the video. They go, the moon corresponds to sloth, envy corresponds to Mercury, lust corresponds to Venus, pride corresponds to the sun, wrath corresponds to Mars, gluttony corresponds to Jupiter, and greed corresponds to Saturn. Now, if you have a very basic understanding of astrology, the planetary correspondences to at least 3 of these should make a lot of sense. Venus being lust makes sense, pride being the sun makes sense, and wrath being Mars makes a lot of sense. However, the other 4 are a little bit more interesting. And we're going to start with the sin of sloth, because sloth is kind of a much more insidious sin than people seem to realize. Sloth is actually the sin of wasting your time and just not caring about anything that actually means anything. This is the sin that is, oh, just lay in bed all day, don't worry about it. You don't need to actually achieve anything because what does it matter? Somebody else will do it. This is the sin of sloth in a nutshell. Sloth is the moon because it is extreme apathy taken to its logical conclusion. It is effectively just laying in bed rot-maxing all day. You aren't doing anything, and you are never going to reach your full potential, but other people probably will, so it's not really a big deal. This is why the sin of sloth is all about not doing things. It is basically just not doing anything to the extreme. And this is where we get to the interesting divide between the esoteric understanding of a sin and the actual, mundane understanding of the sin. When you look at theologians talking, specifically Thomas Aquinas brought up the sins a little bit, When you look into the actual theological ramifications of why Christians say these are the seven deadly sins, it actually starts to paint a picture that the mundane understanding of the sin and the esoteric understanding of the sin is radically different. For example, most people think, oh, sloth is just don't be lazy. Well, in actuality, it is don't allow, flies to fester in your entire your entire surroundings to rot. That is what sloth is in the theological understanding. And there is no sin in the entire catalog that is more misunderstood, in my experience, than envy. Envy is not the sin of just don't desire what your neighbors have. Envy, according to the old theological text that I've read, is not really so much about the desire aspect. It is about evil machinations. Now, what I mean by this is what people think of as envy is like, oh man, I want my neighbor's lawnmower. Well, that's not exactly what envy is. Envy is the jealousy festering into something much more, to where you see your neighbor has a nice shiny new lawnmower, and you want to go out of your way to sabotage said lawnmower. You want to either steal it, destroy it, or make it so your neighbor cannot use it because how dare he have a better lawnmower than you? Who does he think he is? Who does he think he is? Does he think he's better than you? Now, the sin of envy is interesting because it is also spiritually corrosive. All sins are spiritually or physically corrosive, but this one is particularly interesting because it really does fit the old adage of drinking poison and hoping your enemy will die. That is what the sin of envy does in a very, very direct way. Now, going up one, we have lust, and lust is interesting because basically the main issue with lust is it's actually very similar to sloth, funny enough. Lust is trying to fulfill your carnal and material desires, the desires of the flesh, to the exclusion of basically everything else. So it is less of a sin about going through and being like, oh, I want to have a lot of sex, though that is a thing, right? It is, I want to fulfill all of my body's desires, no matter how weird they may be, and it keeps pushing the envelope, and it keeps leading into more and more depravity. That is why lust is a sin. Now, pride is probably the one that everyone gets right off the bat. We all know that the sin of pride is related to overinflated egos, and we all know that the sin of pride relates to the demon Lucifer. Now, interestingly enough, Lucifer is a hilariously complicated spirit, a hilariously complicated mythological figure, and his story is told in various places. But one of the important things about Lucifer is that pride cometh before the fall. Now, pride is the sin of thinking that you are straight up better than everyone else, even if it's true. Pride will cause you to start to think of other people as lesser, or start to think of other people as accessories to your own image. This is why a lot of people, when they come into contact with a narcissist, narcissism is basically the sin of pride taken and turned into a mental faculty in an individual. That kind of stuff is going to be very negative, and people naturally have a tendency of wanting to avoid those kind of people. Now, that is mostly the reason that the sin of pride is actually a sin, is because if you stop thinking of other people as people, you don't care what happens to them. If you don't care about anything but yourself, and you think, oh, I'm the best, therefore everyone should, look at how great I am, that is going to be very prideful, and people naturally have a tendency of trying to avoid overly prideful individuals. Wrath is also a pretty simple one, but it is a little bit interesting when we go to the actual, theological understanding, because what wrath actually seems to be, in the theological text that I was reading a long time ago, was that wrath is misapplied punishment. Wrath is the punishment not fitting the crime, or you are punishing out of anger or something like that. You know, it's the thing of you need to give a slap on the wrist and you cut the wrist off. That is a wrathful act. Wrath is typically just depicted as wanton violence for the sake of violence. That's not really the reason. That's not really a thing. Most people, if they're, like, well-adjusted, aren't going to just be inherently destructive and angry people who are going to want to destroy things for the sake of destruction. Most people, when they go about their day and when they are interacting with the world, are going to be, annoyed at certain things. That's just, there's frustrating things that happen, but you're not going to go all out. Yelling at the cashier because they got your donut order wrong is actually considered a wrathful act in this regard, because you're punishing the poor cashier. That could be interpreted as a lower level wrathful act. Now, hilariously, when I looked at gluttony seems like one of these things is not like the other a little bit too, when you look into it. However, when you realize that the big focus on gluttony was actually about, like, alcohol back in ye olden days, like, they were mostly worried about, like, do not become super drunk. It wasn't about, like, food or drink, it was about people getting super wasted and super hammered. That makes a lot more sense, because when you are drunk, you are much more likely to commit a bunch of horrible acts. And reminder, the 7 deadly sins are the seeds that cause you to actually do sinful acts. They are the things that cause you to actually hurt your neighbor, do bad things to both yourself, other people, and everything else around you. And that is why gluttony, being about drugs and alcohol mostly, is a little bit more comprehensible. Especially when we realize that Jupiter corresponding to gluttony is low-key the writers, it's low-key the theologians making an allusion to the fact that the sign of Pisces also is associated with alcohol and drugs, and basically anything that makes you dissociate. So when we look at it from that angle, it kind of makes a little bit more sense. Now Saturn, everyone that I said greed was associated with Saturn, there's a couple of interpretations of this, and I'm going to just say my favorite one. If you love money more than other people, and you start viewing everything in terms of money, you don't actually care about other people like pride, but you are also going to try to use money in order to actively ruin other people, as long as it is making you more money. It is literally the modern day corporate mindset is greed solidified into legal code. When you go through, like, if you are enjoying a platform, every so often a modern platform will get a moderate amount of issues with it. It will get some kind of issue, and that issue will develop and the site will go down, and this is called enshittification. Well, companies are incentivized to enshittify their, a businessman who comes into a company is incentivized to extract all of the financial value and just kill the company, because there is no reason for them to keep it long term. There is nothing that they gain other than a steady paycheck and increasing stock value. So the way that they solve this is by just sucking the value out of the pre-existing company and then leaving it as a shell or a husk of its former self, because there is no incentive to keeping things alive if you don't have to. And this is where the sin of greed comes in. Greed is all about control. Greed is all about using money as a system of control and limitation. The most common interpretation of why Saturn is the sin of greed is because Saturn, being the inherent limitation, wants to be freed from its limitations via the greed that it is exhibiting. It is trying to steal things, it is trying to take things, it is trying to take all of the things so that it can be free from the limitations that it provides. Because if you pay enough money, limitations cease to exist for 90% of people. And so these are kind of a brief snapshot into the more esoteric understandings, or the more theological understandings of why each sin is what they are, as well as the planetary attributions to them. If you would like to see more of my content talking about the 7 deadly sins and why they are dangerous for occultists, I have that over on Patreon. You can get access to that in the Adeptus tier. I have been Dave the Amateur Magus. Hope everyone is having a good day. If you're not having a good day, I hope your day gets better. Take it easy, take care, and I hope to see you next time.